Good morning folks, welcome back to Meadowcroft Farm. My name is Ian and today we want to talk about our lived experience in terms of working with the trellising here in the tropics. This here is the Tatura Trellising system, which the original concept was for temperate tree crops such as apples and pears. It was developed for a high density system, and the theory was everything can be picked from ground level, so people aren't working on ladders, aren't working with cherry pickers at heights, etc. It was then brought up to the tropics, the tropical fruit trees, not so much for the high density but for cyclone resilience. But it was planted also with high density, which those are some of the issues that we want to talk about that we've come across. The difference between the temperate crops and the tropical fruit crops. Temperate crops, they have dwarfing rootstock. They have a fairly significant dormant period where there's no growth. The pruning, there's a lot more knowledge in terms of pruning. They know which spurs will be vegetative and which will be fruiting spurs, as opposed to the tropical fruit trees, which there aren't really any dwarfing rootstocks. The growth period is almost non-stop, and when you put them in a high density situation, they want to outcompete one another. So it actually encourages growth and they start shooting up and shooting up. That then, if you're not careful, leads to too dense a foliage, no light, and as we've seen with different crops, once you've got no light intersection, you've got no fruit. Literally, we've had trees with no fruit on just because it's been too dark. It will work with slow growing trees, sapodillas maybe. We're okay with the canistels here, they aren't too bad. But other crops where we have come across issues is things like star apples, soursops, rambutan, and I'll try and show you some of the issues. You'll see that with this trellising, they set at a slight angle, and the reason for this is to allow the light interception. With the trellising system, they are planted as close to north-south as you can get them, so that the sun rises in the east, goes all the way over, sets in the west, and so the light gets into the middle. But because they're planted at an angle, one of the issues with several crops was that even with the slightest angle down here, they would start to send up suckering wood, and you were constantly having to go round and prune, because that was taking so much energy, and if you weren't careful, they'd be up 1.5 meters height in no time. Also, the more of an angle, even here, suckering wood would come shooting up, which then closes all this in, reducing your light interception, reducing your harvest. So it's the workload that's the problem. We didn't realise that there hadn't really been any work done in terms of the amount of labour that was involved. So as you can see in the background here, we have probably 10-12 trellises there, which are 100 meters long, and all the trees have been removed, and we are in the process of removing the trellises. The reason being, as I say, because of the ultra high density, planting basically sort of 1.5 meters apart, the trees would be 3 meters apart on one side, and then there'd be one in the middle on the other side. So effectively it was a zigzag pattern, and they ended up 1.5 meters apart. The ultra high density encouraged the vigour that were trying to outcompete one another, and by the time you've finished pruning, because it has to be a light prune, remember the evergreen trees, they're not used to having the branches exposed to direct sunlight, such as the apples and pears. They lose their leaves, they have that dormant period because the sun isn't as intense away from the equator. These equatorial trees are evergreen because they don't want the sunlight directly on the branches. So you had to keep going round doing a light prune. By the time I'd finished 10 trellises, it was time to go back and start again, which is what most people are struggling with. So some of you may have seen in previous videos that we are replanting all the trees, the orchard, but we're replanting with a freestanding tree that we grow with multiple leaders. And the fact that the trees have 3, 4, 5 leaders, it shares that dominance between them, so it calms the tree. They're still vigorous, but they're not as vigorous. The trees will be 4.5 metres apart in a row and 4.5 metres apart with rows, which is the same as what the trellising. The trellisings were 4.5 metres apart, but the ultra high density, it just meant, as I can't get over how much pruning there was. There was 2 concepts with the trellising, and the original concept was to grow a single leader up with horizontal branches. It didn't work in that if you didn't keep on top of the pruning, the high branches shaded out the lower branches, and so the bottom 1 or 2 wires got shaded out and those horizontal branches died. There was also the problem of, because people couldn't keep up with the pruning, they went and pruned really hard, exposing those branches to the direct sunlight in January, February, really high intense heat. That's our summertime. The branches got burnt. These are the horizontal wires. So you ended up with a tree that in theory should have had 5 branches either side, and it might have 1 here and 1 over there, and the rest of them have just died back. We planted like this originally, and we spent 2 seasons and realised that that wasn't working. So there's another concept with the likes of apples where they grow multiple leaders. So we chopped off at the base and we grew either 2 leaders or 4 leaders, in the sense that worked, because each leader that came up was getting sunlight. It did work, but then that backfired because everything was really healthy, everything was growing, so there became even more pruning to do. They were that dense that nothing was fruiting. Whichever way we did it, it kind of didn't work. So that's why we decided we'd go with freestanding trees. It's still high density, but it isn't ultra high density, and it's much easier. You've got less trees to prune, so that helps, but because you can prune them better, you end up with more fruit. We physically ended up with less fruit on the trellising than we do now. The more pruning you've got to do, the more, if you're employing somebody, your wage bill is, which then takes away from any profit. So you've got to work out, given that they're that vigorous, is it worth it? You can't use really mechanical pruning because of this crossbar. So you couldn't have a machine come down the middle and prune all the middle off, because that would hit this crossbar. If you're in the tropics, and you're having to do either yourself or employ people to do the pruning, it's hot, it's humid. In the afternoon, it just starts to get too intense, too unbearable, the heat, the humidity. You can't get somebody to work till 5:30 at night out in the paddock. It's just not easy. Whereas maybe if you've got machinery that was doing the pruning, and you've got yourself or somebody sitting in a nice air-conditioned cab driving up and down doing mechanical pruning, that'd be easier. Another problem, depending on where you are, and if you're growing tropical fruit trees, it's quite likely you'll be in a wet tropical environment. And if you come down here, this is an issue with wooden posts. This is almost hollow all the way through. Now, given that the concept of this was for cyclone resilience, if you imagine your orchard is wiped out, it's all fallen down after a cyclone, and heartbreaking, yes, but you can come in, you can chip it, you can whatever, burn and replant. Imagine trying to do that when the whole trellis has come down. You've got treated wood to get rid of, you've got high tensile wire mixed in amongst it. That would be an absolute nightmare. So the life expectancy of these treated logs in the wet tropics is between 10 and 15 years. So if you have to think about replacing them when you've got high tensile wire there, you've got trees there, and every 10 to 15 years you've got to replace these posts, well, that's certainly not going to be easy. And the only other option that I could think of is that instead of using wooden posts, you use concrete posts. But then, I don't know, the cost of concrete posts is going to go up significantly from putting these in. If you keep your freestanding trees low and open, not really dense, they're less likely to be knocked over by a cyclone. We went through Cyclone Yazi, which was a pretty intense cyclone. Granted, we weren't at the southern part of the cyclone, which is the worst. We were more in the middle, but it was still one hell of a cyclone. All of the tall trees, 5, 6, 7 meters tall, they either got knocked over completely or branches broken, pushed over leaning. All the trees that were around the 3.5 meter height went through it, didn't even get pushed over. So, you know, obviously everybody's got their own ideas of which way to go, but certainly for us, we've fought it for 5, 6 years, and it's just not worth it. Now, we've brought you to another area of the paddock. These were the vase-shaped trees that we planted, but because we've got the trellising in, we thought for the time being we would leave the trellising in place just so we could help to shape the branches. Big mistake, because this trellis is quite close to our windbreak, and we had a tree come over. That tree actually didn't hit any of our orchard trees, didn't hit a single tree. What it did do is go in between them and hit the wire. Just ripped off 3 of the branches and took out 2 trees behind me, and all the way up this trellis pulled down some of the branches. So we had to go round and tie up the branches to try and lift them back up again. And that was all because it hit these wires, and the wires just intertwined between these branches, and it just pulled everything down. So there's, I don't know, there's another issue to think about. A freestanding tree, yes, it would hit that tree or a couple of trees, but it wouldn't take out the whole row, which it kind of affected pretty much every tree. We've got 17 trees on this row, and it's affected every single one in one way or another. A couple of further issues that we've come across. As I said, the young wood, certainly on the jackfruit trees and on soursops and some of the others, it's a very thin bark, and rubbing of the branches, whether it be the wind blowing them and such like, can cause a damage which is an entry point for disease. And when I talk about trying to tidy up an orchard, a trellised orchard, if it did get knocked over, this is something that's quite common, that the tree physically grows around the wire. So it isn't just a matter of you pulling wire out, because that wire is in there. So if you've got trees that have gone down, you're not going to be able to just pull the wire out easy. So in hindsight, if we wanted to go down the trellising route to give support to the trees, we'd probably look at single post, maybe with just a couple of wires to give support to the trunk, but not using them for branches, purely as a support mechanism, with one post. That way, if you wanted to, it's easier to have somebody mechanically prune the top and both sides, as opposed to in the middle of the Tatura trellis. Because of the crossbars, you can't do the internal prune mechanically. Everything has to be hand pruned with them, everything. Okay, so I hope this has given you some food for thought if you're planning on establishing a tropical fruit orchard, in terms of which way to go. This is our experience. This is why we're looking at planting more freestanding orchard. We will still keep the height down, but for us at least, this is the way forward.